I'm RJ Eskow, and we are back on the Zero Hour. Our next guest is Robert Whitaker, who has written an award-winning book called Anatomy of an Epidemic. And that book, I believe, won, let me see now, it won an Investigative Journalist Prize in 2010. The book, he'll tell us more about it, but the book talked about in essence, the epidemic of prescription drug use in mental health care, and there have been some updates on that since then, so I wanted to talk to Mr. Whitaker about it. Are you with us, Robert?
I am. Thanks for having me. I appreciate being here.
Oh, thanks so much for joining us. Now, your book was had an enormous impact at the time, and I read it at the time, and I'm reluctant to summarize your thesis with you right here. So, I mean, briefly, can you encapsulate for readers or listeners who might not have read it,
Sure.
The theme of the book?
Sure. Well, as you mentioned, we're using psychiatric drugs more and more in this country, and if these drugs are as helpful as we think they may be, we would hopefully see the burden of mental illness going down in our society. And instead, the exact opposite is happening. So since 1987, the number of people on disability due to mental illness in our society is now more than quadrupled. So, of course, then you ask why. And then when you go and look at what science is telling us about that, it tells us this. A, the drugs may have a benefit over the short term. I'm talking about antidepressants or even antipsychotics or, say, stimulants for ADHD. But over the long term, study after study has found, in fact, that they increase the likelihood of disability. They increase the likelihood that someone will become chronically ill. And you see this time and time again. So what you really see in the scientific literature is a real worry, in fact, that even as these drugs may be helpful to some, and even that they can be helpful over the short term, over the long term, they increase the likelihood that a person will have a worse outcome. And that finding just doesn't get communicated to the public.
No, I would agree. I would say that to many people that will be a stunning thought that these psychiatric medications, by and large, are not beneficial over the long term. And there's another point that your book made, and there was a development on this that you discussed in an interview recently, which is in the book you talked about the chemical imbalance theory of mental illness and the notion that while that makes it easier in the economic way to sell psychiatric drugs, there's very little to support this. It might even be described as a kind of pseudoscience, and that seemed like a shocking idea just a few short years ago in 2010. But now we have Ronald Pies, who's the editor-in-chief emeritus of Psychiatric Times, saying just a year later, and I quote, "In truth, the chemical imbalance notion was always a kind of urban legend, never a theory seriously propounded by well-informed psychiatrists." And yet I think if you talk to most psychiatrists in this country, they're still basing a lot of their practice on that theory. Isn't that right?
Yeah, absolutely. And if you speak to a group of people who've been diagnosed and you ask how many of them have been told they have chemical imbalances in the brain, virtually every hand in the room will go up. Listen, this is, I think, at the heart of the problem. So we were told, beginning in the 1980s, that these drugs fix chemical imbalances in the brain, like insulin for diabetes. And, that is a story of great progress, because that is telling us that the pathology of these disorders became known, and now we had an antidote to that pathology. But when you dig into the science, you find that, A, it was always just a hypothesis. B, it was a hypothesis born of an understanding of how drugs acted on the brain, psychiatric drugs, and researchers then speculating, in essence, that maybe the problem was the opposite of what the drugs did. So, for example, an antidepressant increases serotonin. They hypothesized that people had low serotonin. But when they actually searched, for example, did research to see if people who were depressed had low serotonergic activity, and this goes back to the 80s, they didn't find it to be so, at least not prior to going on the medications. And so you really see at the heart of this is this extraordinary delusion or a really sort of a white lie that was peddled to the American public.
Well, it's astonishing when you think about it, because it's not even a very white lie. It's a deception. And the science, pseudoscience does seem the right word. I don't drink anymore, but when I used to drink, red wine made me happy. It didn't make me happy because I had a red wine deficiency.
Right.
So, and you add into it, as you well know, someone like Dr. Marcia Angel, who edited the New England Journal of Medicine for 25 years, saying that she has no confidence in drug studies conducted in this country because of the economic incentives. One wonders the extent to, it's easy to understand why drug companies would push these things. Why would psychiatrists, and of course not all of them did, but why would so many psychiatrists buy into this sort of delusional or deceptive set of theories when they're not, unless they're big stockholders in the drug companies? What's in it for them to buy into this?
Well, this is a good point, because it's more than they just bought into it. At the very highest levels of the American Psychiatric Association and high levels of academic psychiatry, they actually promoted these ideas, and they also became engaged in the very drug studies that we now know aren't reliable. They were biased by design. Results were spun. That's what Marcia Angel was talking about. And why is that so? What happened to psychiatry? And really, there's two things that happened. One, in 1980, the American Psychiatric Association published the third edition of its diagnostic manual. And with that manual, they basically adopted a disease model of psychiatric disorders. And as they did this, they ceded talk therapy to other disciplines. So what was their real product now in the marketplace? It was drugs. So they're in a pretty hard place to start saying, and so they want to promote the drugs as safe and effective as possible. And this became a metaphor, in essence, to make their product look better. Mm-hmm. And then the other thing that happened was that academic psychiatry got bought by the pharmaceutical industry in the 1980s and 1990s. And by that I mean is the pharmaceutical companies signed up academic psychiatrists to be speakers, advisors, consultants, and in a wholesale manner. And once that happened, that very much altered how trials were conducted, how they were reported, and what story was told to the public. And I will tell you the first time, so I can remember being as a newspaper reporter writing about how psychiatric disorders were due to chemical imbalances. And at one point I asked a well-known researcher, can you just point me to the research where this was found to be true? And he says to me, and he's just told me, like insulin for diabetes, he says, oh, it's just a metaphor. And I said, what do you mean it's just a metaphor? He says, well, it's something we say to get people to take their drugs because it provides them with an easy understanding of why it's good for them. But I said, it's not true. And he goes, well, not really, no. And I was astonished, but that was the explanation I was given. It's sometimes the explanation you still hear, but as you said, it's really not a white lie. It's just a fabrication.
Right, and in these situations, I'm always asking, as I'm sure you are too, cui bono, who benefits and why. In this case, it's worth noting, I suppose, that the psychiatric community, because they're medical doctors, they're the only members of the psychotherapy profession who can write prescriptions.
Oh, and there's no question about it. That's part of it. This was their product in the marketplace post-1980, and it was essential to this larger story of a disease model. But absolutely, there's a clear guild interest at work here.
So, Robert Whitaker, what's next? I mean, we have this stunning, to me, turnaround where not only depression, which was always a highly ambiguous area for medication, but even schizophrenia and other serious, psychosis conditions are being reevaluated. What's next? Is the reversal of someone like Dr. Pye's a suggestion that there's going to be a major transformation? Because this information's out there, these admissions are being made, and yet surprisingly few people know about it. Are we in store for a psychiatric revolution?
That's a great question, because there are a lot of admissions now from very high-up people that this whole story that's been told in the last 30 years isn't true. So you have even, for example, Thomas Insel, the director of the NIMH, in other words, our top psychiatrist in the country, recently saying the disorders listed in the DSM, by and large, are not valid. They haven't been validated. They're not real. So you have this sense that the diagnostic manual is no good. Then you have a comment by Thomas Insel saying these drugs really aren't very effective. Too few people really do well on them. He recently wrote a blog saying, basically citing a lot of the literature I had cited in Anatomy of an Epidemic, antipsychotics may impair long-term recovery for schizophrenia patients. Those are the comments of a of a psychiatry that's in deep crisis and in some ways intellectually collapsing. But
I hope you'll stay on this beat, because this is of critical importance. This is, to me, feels like a massive scandal that's not getting nearly as much coverage, and I hope you're planning to do some more writing about it.
I'm I have a new book almost done, so I am.
Well, good.
I think it's one of the most remarkable scandals of modern times.
Well, I hope you'll come back on the show when your new book comes out and continue the discussion with us.
Well, thanks very much for having me. I really appreciate it.
You bet. That was Robert Whitaker. His book is Anatomy of an Epidemic, and it is absolutely stunning to hear what is going on in the psychiatric profession. But as we're always saying on the Zero Hour, who benefits? What are the economic motivations? And it doesn't make, by the way, it doesn't make anybody as an individual a terrible person. It makes them, as they say in the economics field, an economic actor. But one who knows who's an actor and who isn't can understand what the play is all about. And that is kind of what we're about here on this show. That wraps it up. We've had I think, a terrific show, this, if I may say so myself. We talked about the nature of consciousness. We've talked about the what's going on with the illusions that drive psychiatry. We've talked about the illusory illness of Morgellons. We've talked about the Harry Potter Alliance, which is the one admittedly illusionary group, and they're doing great work. We'll be back next week. I'm RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.